afternoon, everybody. Can I welcome you all to From Italy to Sweden, What's Behind Today's Populist Revolt. I'm David Axe from Invoke Democracy Now! And Invoke Democracy Now! One of the sponsors of today's session, and I'm one of the producers of the session. Invoke Democracy Now! Is pro-Brexit democracy campaign group set up immediately after the referendum result came in order to combat what seems to become a continuing battle against democracy that's being waged in the UK. I think the issue of populism is one that's very important to interrogate, and I hope that you'll help the panel do that today. I think it's important for a number of reasons, but the one that concerns me the most is that it's become a political swear word and a bit of a throwaway way of dismissing discussion and debate about important issues, so that rather than engaging with ideas that we may or may not disagree with, we can just condemn them as being populist and move on. I know that's not going to happen today, and I'm going to hand over now to Tom Slater, who's going to chair the session.
Thank you very much, Dave. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Battle of Ideas session from Italy to Sweden, What's Behind Today's Anti-Establishment Revolt, sponsored by Time to Talk as well as Invoke Democracy Now!, for which Dave was just introducing you to. My name's Tom Slater. I'm Deputy Editor of the online magazine Spiked, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's discussion. So, what's going on in Europe? Or what the hell has happened to Europe? Depending on your perspective, those are the questions that have been coming up in recent months as populist, anti-establishment parties have continued to make electoral breakthroughs. And I think casting our mind back over the past year, in 2017, with the victory of Emmanuel Macron to the French presidency, with Geert Wilders only coming second in the Dutch elections, there was a mood amongst some commentators that the populist anti-establishment backlash was on the wane, that maybe it had peaked. But increasingly today that feels incredibly premature. Looking at things today across Europe, we've got a populist coalition in power in Italy, a party of the populist right, now third biggest party in Germany, and even Sweden, of all places, having its own populist moment this year. So over and over and over and over again, European publics are rejecting the political mainstream and opting for outsiders, often of a right-wing and anti-establishment hue. So what we want to discuss today is this a well overdue revolt against distant, disdainful elites, or simply a kind of right-wing backlash driven by resentment, anti-immigrant sentiment, etc.? Is the right exploiting people's worst prejudices, or are they kind of occupying the realm of popular politics, perhaps once occupied by the left? And is this anti-establishment turn in general something that people should resist to the hilt, or something that's actually worth engaging with, trying to understand, perhaps even embracing? All of those are things that we'll be discussing over the course of the next 90 minutes. I'm delighted to say we have a fantastic panel with which to kick off our discussion today, and without further ado, I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. They're each going to speak for about 5 minutes. I'm going to keep quite close to time and pass you passive-aggressive notes and things when you've got a minute to go and when you've got to wrap up, so that we can get the discussion right back out to you, the audience, as soon as possible, so we can really open this up. So, speaking first on my immediate left is Dr. Vanessa Pupavac. Vanessa is Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice at the University of Nottingham. After Vanessa, on my far right, we'll hear from James Ball. James is a journalist and author, and his most recent books are Post-Truth, How Bullshit Conquered the World, and Bluffocracy. After James, we'll be hearing from John King, who's on my immediate right. John is the author of 5 novels, including The Football Factory, The Liberal Politics of Adolf Hitler, and Slaughterhouse Prayer. It's fantastic to have John here.
It's 9, actually.
Oh, is it 9?
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to undersell you. Speaking after John, on the far left there is Dr. Sasha Polakow-Suransky. Sasha is Deputy Editor of Foreign Policy and the author of the book Go Back to Where You Came From, The Backlash Against Immigration and the Fate of Western Democracy. And finally, we'll be hearing from, in the middle there, Dr. Ruth Dudley Edwards. Ruth is a journalist and an award-winning author of 12 crime novels, including Murdering Americans and Killing the Emperors. So it'll be interesting to hear her thoughts too. So without further ado, Vanessa, would you like to kick us off?
The Croatian author Miroslav Kulić's article, What is Europe?, 50 years ago observed, When discussing Europe today, we should not forget that there are still two Europes. 30 years on from the end of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War divisions, there are nevertheless other divisions in Europe. Take the fate of Kulesza's fellow Croats as the EU's newest members. A recent newspaper headline declared, "If Croatia is a failed state, does everybody need to migrate?" The article itself, with its provocative headline, actually wanted to challenge the populist left and right narrative of state failure and existential crisis posed in the headline. So what convincing answer is given to people's alarm over Croatia having no future and everybody having to migrate abroad? The expert analysis soothingly replies, in a ranking of 178 countries, from the most at risk to the most stable, we sit really well. In short, don't worry your pretty or ugly populist little heads. Your existential fears of national crisis are groundless because a global league table says we are well off. Unfortunately, seeing the problem of populist discontent as merely a communication or education failure and citing a global league table is not a very convincing answer. But it is systematic of a national and transnational elite out of touch with the realities and concerns of their fellow citizens and fellow Europeans. And it helps explain why people are looking for a different politics and a different European settlement. I think what you have across Europe is a concern that we are being governed by absentee landlords.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. James, your thoughts, please.
I tend, as any kind of journalist does, I always tend to, when someone gives me a premise, to want to kick it around a little bit. And I'm not sure populism has done nearly as well as some people in the UK sort of commentating on Europe would have quite liked. A lot of European countries have quite well inbuilt safeguards. And so even as we're sort of seeing places poll and coming elections around 15, 20%, you know, the firewalls are kind of holding. The sweep isn't quite as grand as people think. I'm not quite sure the narrative holds up. Yes, we're seeing parties that are very unconventional and have views, certainly I think are quite abhorrent. Others, you know, may feel differently. They're doing better than, you know, a sort of establishment lefty than me would like. But is there really a sort of new, huge wave of populism? Not yet. But why are people looking to those parties? I think we have a really bad habit as a political class and as a media class of missing the obvious. We sort of almost, you know, we talk about all of these causes and disillusionment and communication and all of that. I tend to think it's economics. You know, just look at the UK context. You know, Brexit is perhaps the sort of biggest expression of British populism in living memory, probably going back away before that. And it came after about 10 years of a national pay freeze. You know, benefits frozen, yes, sure, but wages haven't been growing very much. Growth isn't there very much. People sort of in the London middle class are still very comfortable, and actually often their salaries are still going up. But you know what? If people's wages aren't increasing, if people don't feel like their kids are going to be better off than they are, if people don't feel like there is prospect and chance to move, people backlash, people rebel against what's there. And everyone else's response seems to be to kind of repeat more of the same. The centre-right is intellectually exhausted, the centre-left even more so. It sort of just wants to keep doing what it's done between the 70s and the 2000s. So if you want to hear new ideas, you tend to have to go at the moment to quite fringe parties and to actually nothing particularly effective and nothing that would fix any of the underlying issues. But if people haven't been getting better, if people aren't getting better off and no one's offering them a way where they will do, they're going to look outside of the mainstream. It's incredibly obvious, and it's not what we talk about. We talk about identity and cohesion and governance, and you know, we talk about anything but the real issue.
Thank you very much, James. And John, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, well, Leaving the EU, the night we left the EU, was one of the happiest nights of my life, and I thought it was a brilliant decision. It was something that I'd had in my mind since I was a kid. When we originally went into the EC, and I saw the adults, a lot of adults around me, how angry they were and how betrayed they felt. Because they knew it wasn't a common market, they knew it was a political organisation, and they saw it as a long-term takeover, long-term coup. So I always had that in me through the years. And while all the sort of there wasn't really a mainstream discussion, but where there was, it was a shouting match over border controls and trade, where really for me the question was all about the future. What is the EU? Where is it going? So for me, it was a vote for independence. It was a vote for democracy. It was a vote for identity, a vote for localism. And like I say, I mean, it was an incredibly positive thing. The country that I saw being talked about by the establishment or the rich and powerful is not the country that I recognise or the people I recognise. So yeah, I suppose afterwards, and I sort of, there was a lot of talk, oh, this was a protest vote against us. It wasn't about the rich and powerful. This was a vote on an issue that people worked out for themselves. So they were faced by the whole of the establishment against them, and they could think it through. And so then I started to think how brave that was. That was a very brave decision when you've got everyone telling you how bad things are going to be and what terrible people you are. And, the focus on immigration, which a lot of people understandably felt awkward about, put a lot of people off voting to leave, in my view. So this was a vote for an issue. This wasn't a party political decision. And people who voted to remain and to leave crossed all the parties. And there's great left-wing arguments for leaving, which are never allowed to be made. I think they said the BBC had one person talking about the left-wing position to leave the EU, and yet, if you go back, that was Labour's position. If Tony Benn and Bob Crow had still been alive, I think there would have been a couple of really good figureheads to represent that. So I'm not really sure what populism means. I know it's used in different ways, but surely democracy is linked into a popular decision or the people's view of things. I don't think it can be lumped in with what's happening in certain European countries by move to right-wing parties, and neither should it be linked into Donald Trump either, because those were party political elections. Again, they were dealing with issues, but those were decisions about parties. I also think that most people have a mixture of views, and then they make a decision which way they go in a vote. And I think when there's a really big issue, people will go against some of the views of the party they'll put up with. They'll vote for them despite their other views in order to get one of those issues looked at. So in terms of Europe, I think there's questions there, and it depends how those parties react. And I think a couple of interesting things, I think, Donald Trump was elected because Hillary Clinton was so despised by big parts of the American working class, people who lived in the old industrial cities, the people she called deplorables. One of the things that Trump promised was to revitalise those industries and to, show those communities some respect. And Bernie Sanders said, if he did carry some of those policies through, he agreed with them, he'd vote them. And I actually think that, because that was such a big issue, if Sanders had been the Democratic candidate, even though he's considered more left-wing, and in America that's considered less acceptable, I think he would have. 1 minute, okay. I think he would have won the election. And I think also in this country, I think if Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, who are long-term Eurosceptics from the Bennite side of the party, who I'm sure are very pleased we're leaving, if they had been able to stand up and to make Labour the party of leave and to put all the arguments from the left that apply, then I honestly believe Labour would be in power right now. I honestly do. So Yeah, okay, that's my time.
Thank you very much, John. And Sasha, your thoughts, please.
Thanks. I'm going to move a little bit away from this country now in my comments and try to talk more broadly about the question you put to us. And I think one of the things that gets lost in this debate, especially in Europe now, is the fact that populism can come from both the left and the right, and that populism can act as both a corrective to a political system or as a threat to that political system. And I think that there are valuable democratic contributions that populist movements can make, but there are moments in time when populist parties can also pose a threat to democratic institutions if they put forward a purely majoritarian view of democracy. The idea that if we have 50% plus one behind us, we can do whatever we like. To hell with minority rights, to hell with certain institutions that are held dear by societies. And this, again, is not something that only comes from the right. And the debate in Europe now tends to focus on this and say, oh, if Marine Le Pen had won the election, it would have been a disaster, and she would have, turned France in a horrible direction. If the AfD ever comes to power in Germany, it's going to take us back to the 1930s. But we can see, even right now, elsewhere in the world, you have populist threats from the left as well, doing just as much harm in a place like Venezuela, for instance. If you look at the legacy of Chavez, if you look at Maduro now, you have a hardline left-wing government putting forward very similar ideas and also posing a threat to core institutions in a country like that. So I think, the first point is that populist parties can do good. They can also be a threat, and those threats can come from either side of the political spectrum. And when those threats exist, we should take them seriously. And I do think that for the most part in Europe at this moment in time, the populist threat is coming from the far right. And I think that one also needs to give credit to these parties for their political savvy. And I spent a couple of years reporting on Le Pen's movement, on Wilders' movement in Holland, and spending time with these leaders and the people around them. And one of the things that I noticed first is that they'd rebranded themselves extremely effectively, and they distanced themselves from the skinhead neo-Nazi legacy that was long associated with the far right, which is not to say that some of those people weren't voting for these parties, but the leadership was making a concerted effort to distance themselves in public. And they also drew in a lot of new constituencies. So you look at Le Pen's voter base in France in the last election, she was getting gays to vote for her, she was getting some Jews to vote for her, she was getting a lot of women to vote for her. And that's quite remarkable if you look at the voter base of her father 15, 20 years earlier. So Le Pen actually succeeded in drawing in all of these voters who never would have considered voting for her dad. And one of the groups that was most interesting to me was ex-communists. So if you look at the north of France, around Calais, Le Pen said this to me herself. She's very aware of it. It was part of her strategy. She said, this district used to vote 80% for the Communist Party. I won 45% there. And the year after I talked to her, she won 52% there in the election. So there was a very targeted effort to sort of bring in these new constituencies, including the old left. And I think that has been very effective for them. And it also raises some questions about what exactly is appealing to voters. Is it an economic policy, or is it more ideological? And hopefully that's something we can dig deeper into. And the last thing I wanted to say is that there's an assumption I hear quite a lot, that is, and we heard it just a minute ago, that the safeguards are in place, Europe's not going to go off the rails, and that's true for now. The safeguards have held for the most part, but to say that a 15-20% share of the vote in a parliamentary system is not a problem or a threat, I think misses something that's happening beneath the surface, and that is that these parties are driving the entire political debate and the norms of political debate and sort of what is considered the center. They're driving all of that to the right. So things are being said and discussed now that were not even on the agenda 20 years ago. And I realize that there may be people who think that's fantastic and these things weren't being discussed, and they should be. And by all means, these opinions should be aired. But I think what's happening is that they're winning without actually winning elections. And so when you talk to some of these activists in populist parties, they say we don't need to win. We get 15 or 20%, but the centrist parties are talking just like we did 5 or 10 years ago. I heard Dutch politicians in Wilders circles say the Labour Party is saying what we said 5 years ago. In Denmark, they were saying the Social Democrats have adopted our policies. So who cares if we win the election? Who cares if we get the keys to the Prime Minister's office? We've already won in terms of rhetoric and public debate. And that's where they've moved the goalposts, and I think that that's extremely significant.
Thank you very much, Sasha. And Ruth, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. Well, I'm really with you on this one. What is populism? As far as I can see, it's just a term of abuse when the people whom the elite, for lack of a better word, are displeased with a result that doesn't come within their definition of what is acceptable, they call it populism, the right or the left. I think actually what you have had is your average Joe around Europe saying, this isn't working, this is enough, we're not happy. And by and large, I prefer the judgment of your average Joe that he makes at his own far side with his wife, with his family, with his neighbours, with his community, about how we think things are going, and they're not happy. And I could give you a lot of reasons for them not being happy. We could start with the fact that the EU is imperialistic. It's an empire. It's creating an empire. And that every time there's a crisis, somebody gets up, Macron these days usually, and says the answer is deeper Europe and more Europe. And I think the average Joe says, no, that does not seem to be the answer. I think most people feel the lack of a competent government, because I think, frankly, that government is almost impossible to run these days. I think globalization has really made it an impossible job. I'm sorry for politicians. But if they can't run their own countries, how are they going to run an empire? I mean, Brussels is not exactly what you would say a shining tribute to common sense and sanity and balance and the rest of it. I mean, it's another crowd of actually middle-aged white men, and who in other circumstances are very bad news, but they're okay if it's Brussels.
Nothing wrong with middle-aged white men.
No, I'm nothing against them, but they're usually being abused in debate among the among the elite. But when it comes to this one, no. I was saying to Vanessa earlier that my favourite comic moment of the week was Juncker saying very sadly that it was a great shame that David Cameron hadn't asked him to get involved in the debate on the referendum. And then, and you talk about our politicians being out of touch. I think they look at Greece. I think they look at how the EU destroyed Greece. I think they know about youth unemployment in Spain and Portugal. I think they look at Italy and the mess that is Italy and the EU interfering in it politically and then saying, oh, those immigrants, well, that's just your tough luck, the Dublin Convention. You didn't understand the implications of that, did you, some of your stuff? Tough shit. You know, that's what they see. And I don't think they're very impressed. And I think they've had it. And you just take Sweden. Everybody says, how could Sweden? Well, Angela opened her arms to the world, and I understand why, and it was a wonderful impulse in its way, and the pastor's daughter from East Germany, trying to make up for the terrible things in the past of Germany, says, come unto me. And then says, by the way, everybody else in Europe has got to take all these people I've invited in, and what's more, they're not allowed to complain about it. And Sweden, being the first up to say, we're nice, liberal, lovely people, open their arms, and then they're not allowed to say there's a problem. And the newspapers are prevented from talking about the rapes that are happening, the terrible... I mean, what happens when you let... when 65% of the incoming people are young men, bursting with testosterone, brought up in totally different cultures, and you say there isn't a problem and you refuse to report on it, and you shut up anybody who complains about it. And that's why Sweden's gone peculiar. I don't think your average Joe wants an empire, and I think they have put up a mighty resistance, and I speak as an Irish person, and if you think it's unpopular being a leaver in smart circles here, try being Irish.
Thank you, Ruth. So you've all actually you've been very well behaved and kept very close to time. So before we go out, I want to pick out a couple of questions very quickly, just because I know there's already a lot on the table and I want to tease a little bit out. So, James, at the beginning, you were talking about how so much of this is potentially driven by economics. But what do you make of Ruth's point that so much of this, the common denominator here is the EU, potentially? What do you make of that point?
I just don't buy it. People really, really don't give a flying fuck about the EU. It's just, you know, I'm from Yorkshire. The accent isn't very strong there. People are pretty pissed off with politics in general, but they also don't really care about it. It's the thing that sort of is often completely missing in the mind of Labour activists. They seem to think everyone wants to go to lots of meetings and have lots of involvement and have lots of stuff. They really don't, you know? So as long as you feel like people are roughly competent and they have your best interests at heart, you kind of don't care. You know, the proudest achievement of the British public is, frankly, that we've had a country where you could be apathetic for a long time. You know, not turning up to vote is probably a vote of confidence in the system as it is. That's not where the world is right now, and it's not where people are right now. And I really think we do everything we can to dance around the core of it, and it's that people aren't confident that their kids will be able to own a home, will be able to get a good job, will be able to have a good income. They're not confident they'll have their own pensions, and they're not confident, they don't feel like they're getting their fair share of the pie. I think if they had that, they don't really, I think, care that much either way about whether we're in the EU or not.
Okay.
Including a lot of Leave voters. It's just they want something to change because the status quo isn't that great, you know?
Okay. On that point, quickly, Vanessa, are we at risk of overplaying the populist revolt then in that sense? Are we reading too much into it, as James is saying?
No, I think we're underestimating it, because at the moment what you have is people unable to. You have a situation where, in key respects across Europe, there aren't enough parties, or there aren't particular parties that express their concerns, and I think it's completely underestimated. I mean, maybe people in Britain, given the referendum vote, are moving away from discussions about Europe and are thinking about life beyond Europe. But within continental Europe, the EU is a major issue. And what's very striking is the Euro pessimism, both amongst those who are critical of the EU, but also amongst advocates of the EU. There is a major problem with the current European settlement that is not working for the majority of Europeans. To take one popular young Croatian politician, Ivan Pernar, of the Human Shield Party, a party that came about with trying to defend people from mortgage bankruptcy and the repossession of their houses. In a much replayed speech across the region, speech in the Parliament, he said, "What have we gained from EU and NATO membership? We are mere servants who do as we are told. We didn't gain new markets, but we lost our own. We have fewer employed and the exodus of thousands abroad to find work." The discussion in Croatia amongst ordinary people is, what is our future? Do we have any future? Will we exist as a country, as a community in the future? What does it mean if all of our young people are going abroad?
Yeah.
There is a profound sense of crisis across Europe. And whereas Greece, 2 years ago, Greece was perhaps seen by advocates of the EU as the exception, what I find now with arguing with advocates of the EU is that they're now talking about positive exceptions as opposed to negative exceptions. A positive exception of the Czech Republic and so on. They've given up on the sort of hearts and minds of Southern Europe in many respects.
And Sasha, on the point, you were sort of discussing the argument, which we've heard a lot, which is the idea that the populist revolt is on some level a kind of threat to democracy. It was a potential threat to democracy. But how do you square that with, I mean, these are all electoral revolts. If anything, the message that we seem to be getting is that people are angry and irritated that their concerns aren't being reflected in those democratic institutions. You know, are they really a threat to democracy, or are they not actually a means through which this could become more democratic, effectively?
it very much could be, but again, I think that this is the division between the sort of correctives and the threats. They're not always threats. What worries me is that in the leadership of many of these parties, take the AfD in Germany, you have a sort of unapologetic nostalgia for a very dark period in German history. You have leaders of the AfD essentially quoting Nazi officials and repurposing those arguments in the press today. You have a regional leader saying that the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin is a monument of shame. You know, these are not innocuous statements.
But they're also not explicitly arguing to say overthrow democratic rights.
No, and I'm not saying that this is going to happen tomorrow or overnight, but I think that we should recognize when a movement or a party is using rhetoric that resembles damaging rhetoric in the past, and it could go in this direction. On the other hand, it could be a very corrective and positive movement, but again, I think that's where you have to look at ideology. And you talk to someone like Alexander Gauland, the co-head of the AfD, you talk to someone like Marine Le Pen, and it's quite clear when you dig down into their policies and their rhetoric that their vision isn't a vision of liberal democracy. It's to me, based on my conversations with these people, a pure form of majoritarianism, and I don't think that that's the kind of democracy that we should be arguing for. By all means, the people should have their voice and push back against unaccountable institutions, and I think that many of the criticisms of the EU bureaucracy in Brussels are completely valid and would agree with them. But I don't think that we should then write off all of the dangerous statements and dangerous ideas that these parties have and assume that if they come to power, none of that would come to pass.
And John, because you were speaking a lot about the left and the left's failure to kind of embrace Brexit, or at least the left voice for Brexit being somewhat absent from the debate. But do we not have to face up to the fact that a lot of these revolts are taking explicitly right-wing forms, and on some level feel like or appear to be a kind of repudiation of a lot of certainly the left, the liberal left, but even parts of the left itself? I mean, can the left even capitalise on this, I guess is what I'm saying, or are they actually part of what people are revolting against at this point?
Well, I mean, if you look at the vote to leave the EU, I mean, like I say, that was an issue. You know, UKIP rose up as a one-issue party which focused on that, and it was very successful. Got nearly 4 million votes, I think. It would have got, I think, many million more Conservative votes if Cameron hadn't given us a referendum. But then in the election after, that party fell away, and I think it's 80-odd% people voted for the traditional parties. So, you know, I don't think things have changed that much, and I don't think, you know, the attitude of people. I don't think cultures and people change just because you've had a vote on one issue. So, yeah, I mean, I think Labour could have embraced it, and you know, obviously at the moment there's a battle going on between the two sides. I think the majority of MPs don't accept it. I think the establishment doesn't accept the vote. You know, to different degrees, they're finding ways to undermine it, to keep us linked in with a view to getting us there in the future when all the old people die. You know, which they've said. You know, look at Clegg and Vince Cable, you know, the great Liberal Democrats, you know. So you know, I think the left could have done more. So they're in a battle at the moment about the nature of how we leave. Really, I think our establishments let us down. I think there should have been a cross-party group and to deal with this, or a unity government instead of people playing politics. You know, because there are differences in how we leave and the way those sort of things go. But I just don't see it as a collapse of the system. I mean, I think if anything, you know, I mean, I believe in liberal democracy, and I think most people do. I think the problem you've got is people who set themselves up as being liberal-minded actually aren't. And so they use these arguments, but they're all living in their big houses. They're all, I mean, you can just see the fallout after the vote, which was, to me, actually a shock. So what they've done in the 2 years since, they've said that the people who voted to leave are stupid, right? So, as if that's possible, or they're naturally thick. And they've tied that in with being uneducated. And by that, they mean people who haven't been to university. Now, most people in this country haven't been to university. And people who haven't been to university generally might have a bit different view of the world. So that's one smear. The second is obviously the racist, fascist, etc. It's been around for a long time. But probably the real scraping of the barrel was to attack the elderly and to say they're not worth the vote and they're voting for the past, when really those people have a knowledge. They have a knowledge of the EU. They've seen it They've seen us go into it. They've seen all the arguments over the years. They actually have the knowledge about the EU. So, I mean, they're being marginalised and insulted and bullied, saying, OK, you've got to take the establishment view because our academics and our political system, we know better than people. So it goes back to sort of the people. People pass down knowledge and they pass down history.
Yeah. Just at that point, I just want to bring Ruth quickly in before we go back to the audience. So Ruth, whilst many of us who oppose the EU or oppose the kind of technocratic establishment, or however people might like to describe it, are we not at risk of kind of sugarcoating some of the characters who've been able to profit off of this, the Geert Wilders, the Marine Le Pens? Are you not in danger of so openly celebrating this revolt that we're not paying attention to some of the political forces that are being able to tap into it and the slightly nasty undertones to them, as Sasha might say?
I wouldn't argue with that at all. I mean, of course, it was an opportunity for them, but that isn't my major worry. I mean, my major worry is what's going to happen and what will be exploited by both hard left and the hard right if the people who are fed up are ignored. I mean, they are really playing with fire on this one. I just want to tell you a very quick story about somebody I was at university with in Dublin many, many years ago. His name was Peter Sutherland, and he became the great EU man. And Peter got to be a commissioner at a very early age, got to be chairman of the GATT talks in his early 30s, ended up chairing a bank just at the right time to be doing that, then got into Goldman Sachs. And I think when he sold his shares, they were worth something like $500 million. And he was a wild enthusiast for the EU. And I remember he tweeted after the referendum, "This must be overturned." Yep. That was Mr. Brussels in his heart. He also, I may say, was the Pope's advisor on immigration and the UN man on immigration. And he said that we must have open borders and there should be absolutely no block to anyone. He did live, and he's dead now, he did live in 2 gated houses, one in Dublin and one in Dublin. Oh, and I forgot the French one.
On that point, I think we should bring it out to the audience for your...
And you needed a lot of servants.
Yeah. So we're going to take a handful of questions at a time, so panel, don't feel the need to jump in just yet.
I wanted to take great exception to one thing Jane said, which was, it's obvious, it's all about economics. And I don't actually object to the economics bit, because I think there's quite a lot of truth in that we do forget that a lot of people across Europe have had stagnant living standards for a long time. That's true. What I object to is the it's obvious part, because it seems to me there's an awful lot of other things going on. I mean, just one thing in particular, you can see across Europe, probably a bit less obvious in Britain, that the traditional social democratic parties, the so-called left-wing parties, are in decline. So the rise of so-called populism hasn't happened in a vacuum. It's happened in a context where the traditional parties are already suffering enormously. And the conclusion I would draw from that is that the terms left and right don't really mean anything. I mean, almost everyone on the panel has used the terms left and right. But I would suggest if we really want to get to grips with this, we should ditch the terms left and right. I mean, I was quite frustrated by something Sean said, not because I disagreed with you, but I agreed with a lot of what you said in terms of describing what was happening. But you were still kind of clinging on to left, right, different end of the spectrum, where it seems to me to have a useful discussion, we should ditch those terms and try and rethink what's going on.
My question follows on really from the last one. We need to define as far as we can what populism is. My working definition is that populist parties don't actually believe in democratic representative government. They will use the system to gain power, rather like the communists did in Czechoslovakia and other places just after the Second World War. And I think this is a very dangerous development indeed. I don't agree with, I think those members of the panel that thought it was somehow controllable or not to worry about it too much. The other point I want to make is in relation to James. If I heard it right, I think you said that not voting was somehow okay or helped democracy. Well, not to vote is a vote for fascism. And we've got to remember, although I don't think we are in the Weimar Republic went down because people ceased to believe in democracy itself and they voted for fascism. And there are uncomfortable echoes in Europe at the moment, and I do have a lot of sympathy with what Sasha has been saying. So I'd quite like your comments on that.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow on from the first question that was asked, and particularly directed at James. Because
I'm doing well today, aren't I?
I'd be interested from his perspective as somebody from inside the centre-left, as to why it is he thinks that in Britain and right across Europe, the centre-left elites now have total disdain for their own societies and have become complete prisoners of sort of identity politics and neo-feminism and what have you. And that agenda is clearly turning off huge numbers of traditional Labour and Social Democratic and, in America, Democratic Party voters. And so we've seen the centre-left not only wanting to subcontract government out to transnational bodies, but actually taking measures within their own societies that are seen as being contrary to the interests and the traditional liberties of the people within those societies, particularly in relation to free speech. And just last point in relation to the point that's just been made by that gentleman, the only people who are advocating dismantling democracy are not the so-called far right anymore. It's the elites within the centre-left who are talking about not respecting the results of referendums, who are even talking in The Guardian now about 19th century Tory ideas of introducing some sort of educational test before people could be allowed to vote.
Thank you. Someone else should have the microphone there. Yeah.
The economist Mark Blyth makes a very good point that the first major populist revolt, and I hate the word as well, was actually in our own backyard in my country, Scotland, where a centre-left party absolutely wiped the floor with the left, the old Labour Party. They are in power, they've been in power for a long time, that won't change anytime soon, and strangely, they're pro-EU. So I think you're being too formulaic, as the chap over here saying it's a far-right phenomenon. It's not necessarily a far-right phenomenon. It's a mixed bag here. 5-star in Italy, the biggest crisis the EU have at the moment, is far from being far-right. So I think we've got to be very careful about this formulaic approach to the word populism. It's much more diverse than we imagine.
I think a lot of what James has said has been very astute. I think your comment that a lot of people don't really care about politics and about EU membership when things are going well, whilst it is regrettable, and whilst I appreciate the comments that not voting isn't good for the system, I do understand apathy. I think what Sasha said was very interesting about how populism is not necessarily a force for evil, and the right questions are being asked. I'd just like to question what Ruth and John have been saying about this is a decision made by the average Joe, to use your phrase. And yes, I do appreciate that, but this is a decision being made out of necessity, because as James said, people are largely not interested. And to what extent do people have access to a free media, to unbiased information? I was at a talk this morning on data and access to information, and it seems that whoever has control of that has control of these systems. And as truths are beginning to come out later, you're saying that it wouldn't be to respect democracy to question those values and those decisions, but if they've been made on fake news or false ideals, should they not be questioned? And I do understand your belief in the decision of the average person. I don't want to sound elitist, but how interested... Sorry.
That formulation will do you no favours.
But yeah, is that something that we need to consider? Who's in control of the media and how much power do they have with regard to the rise of populism?
I don't think it's necessary to have a deep interest in politics to have a sense of what's going on in your country and what you want for it. And I think that's what was being expressed. I know people who never voted in their lives but voted this time round because they had a sense that possibly this might do something about the loss of control they were feeling so strongly. You know, and immigration had something to do with it. It wasn't xenophobia. It wasn't racism. It was a sense that everybody kept saying there's nothing we can do about this. So give us back control was a sense of it, a sense of sovereignty, and sovereignty matters. The sense that it's your country, not in a narrow xenophobic sense. I mean, remember that just the week after the referendum, there was a poll asking what should happen to the EU people in the country now? And the answer, 85% said they should stay. This is not xenophobic. This is a sense that we're not in charge of our own destinies anymore. And you don't have to have a degree to examine that notion. And as I say, I know people who never voted before, and they thought this time their vote might actually count. And it did count. And I know some of them are actually going to vote in the next election because they've got interested in politics. And if this was overturned, the consequences for democracy actually frighten me.
And James, there was a few questions directed at you. Are you effectively advocating fascism? Which is but pick up on anything you want.
So, I mean, I'm not voting is the least popular of my many unpopular opinions, but you know, I'm on the centre left. I'm used to having unpopular opinions. Nothing like sort of being on the centre left to paint a target on yourself either. If no one in your constituency earns your vote and makes you want to go and spend 20 minutes out of your day for a decision that won't change the outcome, then don't do it. There is for me no shame in that, and it's not against the system. The system includes the right not to turn out and to play PlayStation for half an hour instead. In terms of sort of the general points made, I think the sort of the key second half of the argument, which I might not have made properly, is I do think it's all about economics. It is about people's living standards. It is about people's sense of fairness, and it is about what people think their kids' futures will look like. And the reason I think, you know, sort of saying that I was leaving out the decline of the traditional parties, the reason that those factors are causing people to abandon traditional left and often in Europe centre-right parties as well, is that they're not offering an answer to them. You know, where is growth going to come from? Where is a better future going to come from? Where is money going to come from? There's sort of quite boring, staid, keep on keeping on comments. There's a real lack of any offer to people who feel left behind from mainstream parties, which is why fringe ones are rising. I actually don't think it's about identity politics, and I don't think it's sort of, I get very irritated when people talk about sort of the left not understanding working class voters or not sort of connecting with people, because you know what, I grew up northern working class, and the people who talk the most utter nonsense about northern working class people tend to be the ones who are speaking on their behalf. You know, my brother left school at 16 and joined the army, and he's a lifelong Guardian reader, and he's to the left of me. People aren't the caricatures that they thought. I don't look like I did, but I actually grew up in a mixed-race British Muslim family. I hear more anti-Muslim rot from middle-class people on panels than I ever did growing up. You know, working classes are not this, you know, racist, xenophobic, homophobic, homogenous blob that they're often talked about in these populism debates. And it's often the people who are supposedly saying we should listen to working class people who speak this nonsense. Generally, the core of it is, if you have a real offer to real people, if you have something that will benefit them, if you sound and look like them, they will vote for you. And at the minute, that is missing from mainstream politics.
I think a lot of the vote to leave was about identity. I do feel that. I think what you say about, you know, lumping people and so, I agree with all that. But then large chunks of those people voted to leave, didn't they? Because they had a traditional Labour viewpoint.
I have many leave voting friends.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I think also that the point someone said about calling everything left and right, I think things are much more complicated than that. I think the party political system, you know, I don't know, it seems to be getting worse. It seems to be getting more and more constipated. You know, people have to have a set of positions on every single thing. And, you know, the majority of people have mixed views. So, you know, you'd like to sort of hope that that could sort of change one day. I sort of thought maybe the Brexit vote, or the vote to leave, it's not Brexit, the vote to leave, you know, would have made the politicians look at themselves a bit more, but they're digging themselves in, really. They don't want to give up their positions of power and their wages and stuff. So, but yeah, I mean, I think identity is a big one. You know, if you think how many people voted, I think people were interested. I think people were interested about the idea of the EU. I mean, it's the biggest democratic mandate ever, isn't it? It's 35 million people voted. So I think people were energised by it. My feeling is people who wanted to leave had maybe had more passion about it. I think a lot of people who voted to remain don't have a real knowledge or real interest in the EU, but were obviously scared of possible economic consequences. And also, like I said before, I think a lot of people voted against it because I didn't like the focus on immigration. I think millions actually voted to remain because of that focus. Whereas I believe that if it was actually, a proper discussion that you looked at the history of the EU and you looked where it's going, because it is about the future, if you looked at centralisation of power, if you looked at the undemocratic nature of it, it's got the potential to be anti-democratic, in my view, And I think if you'd had a real proper discussion, I think the vote to leave would be much, much bigger.
Thanks, John. And Vanessa, is there anything you want to pick up on? I'm particularly interested in this beyond left and right question, but anything else as well?
Well, I think for me the critical issue is the point raised about it's not just the economy. I think that's right. I mean, I think it's really insulting to people to see them just as concerned in terms of just their material circumstances. I think people are concerned about self-determination. I think self-determination matters. And historically, across Europe, self-determination has been one of the most wonderful animating ideas in Europe. It animated people in 1989 in Eastern Europe against the Soviet bloc. And a concern for self-determination is animating people now. I think it's a mistake to see reading back, to see things as a continuing apathy. I think we have a situation in recent years where people have woken up. Now, there may be the economics in it in terms of a reliance on expert governance was seriously questioned in the aftermath of 2008. But I think it goes far further than that. And because I think what the European settlement is doing in taking away so many decisions from individual countries, there is a hollowing out of citizenship. So in terms of this question, the question we've got is what lies behind European populism? I think there's a sense that, that people persist in the ideal of self-determination in their personal lives and in the life of their country or their community. And I think they are questioning their elites that say, well, we can't control our lives. And I think the referendum vote accidentally picked up on a key motivating force of people and one that resonates, has got a long resonance historically, the ideal of ancient liberties, of regaining one's liberties. And that is something that's animated people in Britain, but it has animated people across Europe against empire or newer forms of non-imperial empire.
Mm. And Sasha, just before we go back out to the audience, particularly this question of, is it the liberal left in their kind of histrionics in response to Brexit, open discussion about whether old people should get the vote, and also just discussion of how is the neatest and quickest way to overturn this? Didn't that reveal, as that gentleman said, that if the threat to democracy is coming from anywhere, it's coming from the establishment rather than the far right, as it might be?
Okay, lots of questions. Let me respond to one of the early questions from the audience about left and right. I plead guilty to using antiquated terminology. I think you're absolutely right that one of the things that's happening, and what I meant to say and to illustrate by the Le Pen example of Le Pen winning former Communist Party voters, is precisely what you're talking about, is this blurring of those traditional boundaries. So I think that what is helping politicians like Le Pen, but also parties like the Danish People's Party in Denmark, is the breakdown of social democratic parties, traditionally seen as the center-left, and parties that are called far-right, poaching those voters, and often consciously going after those voters, as Le Pen did with the ex-communists and as the Danish People's Party has done with ex-social democratic voters. When they went from 12 to 20+% in a series of Danish elections, most of that difference came from ex-social democrats. So what's happening is they're appealing to them, and I think part of that appeal has to do with economic policy. And if you look at Le Pen's arguments that she's putting to these ex-communist voters and to the Danish People's Party, they're basically defending the welfare state on ethnic grounds. And so the pitch that they're making is for a sort of nativist nanny state. We love our elder care and child care and excellent health care and all of these subsidized education programs, but for us and no one else. And that has had great appeal for former social democratic and communist voters in a lot of these countries. And so I agree with everyone who said that the traditional definitions of left and right are being blurred, and that we should probably be coming up with new terminology to look at this. And one of the terms I would use, and some people see this as a derogatory term, but I would use the term nativist to describe many of these parties in terms of the policy programs that they're articulating. It's a defense of certain benefits for the natives. And you can take that as you will. Some people see it as a slur. I think it's actually quite descriptive of the political program of a lot of these parties. Now, to answer your question about center-left disdain, or was someone in the audience, I think that there is something to this argument. You know, the Hillary's deplorables comment, a lot of this has come up in the US election campaign and the aftermath. What you see in my country is a sort of total disdain for the Trump voter. So the anger of the left isn't necessarily being directed at Trump and the people that he's appointed, who often, by the way, do not represent the forgotten man in the flyover states in the middle of the US, but it's directed towards the Trump voters, and you hear a similar rhetoric. These are a bunch of idiots. Oh, aren't they such fools for voting for Trump? And I would agree that that's completely counterproductive for the left and for the Democratic Party in the US and for many parties that define themselves as on the left in Europe. It will only cut further into their support base. And so it's very counterproductive. But I would say that rather than the identity politics framing of that is part of what's going on, that voters feel that what Labor parties or social democratic parties or the US Democratic Party once stood for is no longer part of their campaign pitch. I think that is part of what's going on, but I also think that the counter push from these far-right populist parties and this sort of nativist defense of the welfare state is a big part of it, because they're moving onto their turf. You know, these parties are actively going after voters, and the traditional left parties have essentially ceded that terrain to them. And I think that that's a big part of what's happening. And it applies to the Trump campaign as well. Not that there's much of a welfare state in the United States, but you know, Trump did put forward an economic argument in the Midwest, where I come from, in Michigan, in Ohio, in Wisconsin, and managed to win Michigan and Wisconsin, which have gone Democratic for decades. So I think that there is a significance to that. I want to say just one more thing since you raised it.
If you can do it in about 10 seconds.
Yes. The elderly vote. This is just a point to put out there because it's interesting. Here, this is discussed as a young versus old thing. Oh, the old voted for Brexit and the young were against it. If you look at the results in the French election, it was exactly the opposite. So the over 60s voted something like 70% for Macron in the second round. And it was actually young voters who went disproportionately for Le Pen. And so it raises this question of how nostalgia, and sometimes nostalgia for an era you didn't live through, plays into election campaigns. And in France, that was much more influential, I would argue.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Right, we can go back out. I'm going to try and do 2 more rounds of these. I'm going to ask both the audience and the panel to keep it brief.
Yeah, I was actually picking up on something Sasha said about the German AfD, and my question is whether you think that the AfD is actually representing its own voters, because I actually have doubts that it does. So it has a vile right-wing rhetoric in part, but there are also surveys showing that 80% of the AfD voters think the party is too right-wing. It's not really representing its people, it's more representing what Ruth described as a general discontent. It's a protest party swimming on this wave. It's not the populist uprising. It's just profiting from it. It's scrounging from it, if you want. And it's not a homogeneous group either. So it doesn't have a clear political, ideological program at all. We now have Jews for the AfD, a group which has just been founded last week. So it shows that we're talking about something, I think, much, much more complex. And I'd probably side with the point made that we have too few parties. That's the whole problem.
I'd just like to backtrack a bit to a claim that was made by a member of the panel right at the start. How are fringe populist parties supplying like new ideas? Maybe mainstream parties aren't supplying these new ideas enough, and maybe they're not reflecting the common concerns enough of sort of the common man. But the lines of argument that are taken by fringe parties seem fairly reminiscent to me of ancient political ideas that have been oft-repeated in specific economic and political circumstances throughout history. And I'd just like to see how you'd respond to that.
Is there a solution for better representation in the kind of political systems that we've got at the moment? If we're seeing the rise of anti-establishment parties as a potential threat to democracy, then what is the solution to counter that?
Thank you very much. My question is for the entire panel. In all the gloom, do you see any signs, probably particularly within the, certainly within the elites and the mainstream centrist elites, but perhaps particularly in the centre-left, of just how serious the problem is? I would particularly just quickly say Mr. King and Dr. Dudley Edwards' points really hit home with me. I worked for, not in, but for the European Commission. I was working with the successor agency to the KGB in the Ukraine. The EU missions there were certainly not the Entebbe raid, not by a long shot. And what Dr. Dudley Edwards says, and particularly about Sutherlandism, I have seen this firsthand. That hits home. Smug, self-satisfied, historical and strategic illiteracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like the point about this being more to do with self-determination than left or right or economics necessarily, especially seeing as a lot of these arguments being made from people across the sort of class spectrum. I don't think it's necessarily a pure working class uprising. And I think that the EU itself seems to symbolize the idea of degraded self-determination. And someone earlier pointed out that Scotland is very pro-EU despite wanting to secede from the UK, or the SNP, sorry. But the point being that, again, could be argued as the notion of we don't have enough self-determination against England rather than the EU. So I just wanted to ask, do you think that, to what extent do you think self-determination is the real issue, and do you think there's anything you can do about it?
You spoke about why you thought ex-communists and social democrats support Marine Le Pen, but why do you think that Jewish and LGBT groups did the same?
Vanessa, is there anything you want to pick up here?
Yeah, I think in terms of Southern Europe or Eastern Europe, one of the concerns is that their demise as political communities. You know, they came out of the Soviet bloc. A core concern was national self-determination, but they find themselves in another bloc that appears to be circumscribing their self-determination. And one of the core concerns is a return to the demise of them as countries, as sovereign entities, and becoming again borderlands of insecure spaces. And this is a critical issue in relation to how people understood the migration crisis 3 years ago. See, what you had is people walking across Europe, making a judgment about the societies that they were passing through. And that was a deeply disturbing experience, because what those migrants were doing was telling those countries that they were walking through that you do not have a secure future. The only secure future is in Northern Europe. And that's what I mean in terms of what lies behind the European populism. It is a concern that the current European settlement is not working.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. And John, is there anything you want to pick up on?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, the idea of self-determination, also the young vote, you know, it's made out to be a split between generations. You know, personally, most of the young people I know voted to leave. So I'm not sure about the polls, but What you do find when you talk to younger people is, and it's not anyone's fault, but there's like a sort of misunderstanding of what will happen if we leave the EU. I mean, some people think we'll never be able to travel again. You know, some people that actually, you know, someone I know was talking to at his work, you know, they refused to believe him when he said that the EU makes laws that override our laws, that are on our, you know, that influence us. They just refused to believe him. They said he was mad. So I think a lot of it is knowing the history of it and actually having that fair discussion. And it's no one's fault. It's just not taught. So you sort of had a referendum that took place in a vacuum with no, you know, no looking to the past and how we went in and the big lie. If you want to talk about big lies, talk about the big lie, the so-called common market. I mean, even Ted Heath knew it was a political takeover, as I think he later admitted. So I'd question that. And then also, you know, the idea of self-determination. How do you get self-determination back? Well, you know, we had a vote in the referendum, and that will give us self-determination back if the establishment carries it through. And to do that, you know, as Tony Benn said, you can't have one law made outside of your democratic process. Otherwise, you don't live in a democracy. So any of these things that are being discussed, you have to have no influence by the ECJ. I mean, it's very, very simple. And so we're at that point now where if our political class do this, which they're trying not to, you know, then we will have self-determination again, and then it will be an internal political battle. And in a way, I think it does go back to the main parties. As the bloke over there said about the SNP, you know, they've risen up and they have their, you know, they have a very strong position. I mean, obviously they have a lot of they have a lot of positions on things, but you know, they have the, you know, the gear behind them is for independence. So, you know, they're still there. You know, they are still there. And, you know, I mean, I hope Scotland doesn't leave the UK. I really don't. But, you know, I think it's good for democracy. And, you know, there's lots of good reasons that you know, that people have that they want to. What I don't understand is why would you become independent and then give it away to the EU? I mean, to me, I mean, that's insanity. But then I think there is a split within the SNP. As I understand, there are a lot of people who wouldn't want to do that either, just as there were in Ireland, you know. So.
And Sasha, is there anything you want to come back on?
Yeah, so to respond to the question about French Jewish voters and LGBT voters, the short answer is that Marine Le Pen very effectively presented Muslim immigrants as the primary threat to both of those groups and told them, we, the Front National, are the only ones who can protect you from that threat. The only other person making that argument was Benjamin Netanyahu saying, leave France, come to Israel. So I think it's unfortunate in the sense that if as a French Jew, your only choice is between leaving the country or voting for the daughter of an unapologetic Nazi sympathizer, that's rather unfortunate. And I think that there wasn't enough coming from other politicians saying, we recognize this threat. There has been violence against Jews. There's been rampant anti-Semitic violence, and some of it coming from the children of immigrants or from immigrants. There were also immigrants who saved Jews in the basement of a kosher supermarket while people were trying to shoot them. So it's a more complicated situation in France than Le Pen would let on. But that was the marketing tactic, and it wasn't as effective with Jewish voters in France as it was with the ex-Communist Party voters. There were smaller numbers, and it's harder to poll, and there's still many, many Jews, even on the right in France, who would never go near anyone in the Le Pen family for obvious reasons. And so those memories of the father are very deep. And for the LGBT voters, it was similar, and the numbers are clearer and larger if you look at some of the polling of gay male couples in France who were big supporters of Le Pen. So that's that question. The solution question is a huge one, so I won't really go there. But one thing I did want to touch upon is the five-star movement in Italy, because you raised this earlier, and we haven't really talked about it in detail. Five Star's origins are not on the right. And it's now seen as grouped in with right-wing populism because it happens to be in a government with an extremely right-wing populist party. And I would argue that Five Star has effectively been steamrolled by Salvini and the League to the point that even though they're the larger portion of that coalition, the policy agenda is being completely dictated from the far right. So turning boats of refugees away, that's Salvini. The comments just a few days ago about shops run by immigrants should really close by 9 p.m., that's Salvini. So Five Star has sort of been eclipsed, and its actual ideological content is sort of absent from political debate. And one thing that I think might be interesting is if the left of that party, someone like Di Battista, comes back into politics and asserts that branch of Five Star and says, this is what we stand for, perhaps pulls out of the coalition or tries to redefine it on those terms, that would make the Italian story very interesting, and it would also shift this narrative that populism is solely a reactionary right-wing phenomenon. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but it would be interesting.
Mm. Ruth.
Well, I'd like to pick up on Scotland and Ireland and self-determination. I began as an historian, and I'm still writing about the revolution that Ireland had in 1916. And there was a lot going on a century after it. And it is a matter of great pride to Irish nationalists that a small number of people started a rebellion and didn't care about the consequences, which actually led to about an enormous amount of violence and misery and 40 years of extreme poverty. But we did get our independence, which was always the mantra, but we got our independence. And I find it actually quite hilarious that it's impossible to have a conversation with a lot of Irish people about the British are looking for their independence. There is no sympathy for this position at all, because they rely on the British, actually, in the corridors of power. They always have. They feel they've been abandoned. They feel they've been lost. And so they put their faith in Brussels. Now, how Ireland, having, as I say, been so proud of its independence, can actually hand over sovereignty as joyfully and trustingly and foolishly as it's been doing. It didn't do anything to try to do some sort of unofficial deal with the British about how to sort out the Northern Ireland problem on the border there. They didn't pay any attention to the recent history when the taxpayers of Ireland were sacrificed to the German bankers, just as the Greeks were. And that's what happened. They know that's what happened, but they're choosing to forget it. So they are being weaponized by the European Commission. Monsieur Barnier tells the Irish what to do, and they've been turned into the major hurdle, and it's bogus. I mean, I could bore you for hours on the subject of how bogus it is and how it has nothing to do with anything. It has nothing to do with anything. It's sacrificing another little country. One of the most important books I read in the last couple of years was Yanis Varoufakis' book, Adults in the Room, and I recommend it to everyone, really. Now, his politics are not my politics. They're a bit more like yours. Yeah. But what's really important about that book is that he tries to get something that will stop Greece being destroyed, to get a deal. And he recorded all the conversations with the EU people he talked to. And it's absolutely eye-opening. I mean, it's about 500 pages that your eyes come out on stalks. You cannot believe the duplicity of it. You cannot believe the cynicism of it. You cannot believe that everything in the end ends up with Angela. And, you know, the last chance you have is go to Angela. And Angela says, yes, 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 that'll be fine. And then sends you back to somebody called Tom, I seem to remember actually, who was the person who had stymied him in the first place. It's shocking. And it's a story of how a little country was sacrificed to the greater good of the project. And they'll do that with Ireland. And they will do that with anybody small. They can't do it to France. And they wouldn't have been able to do it with the UK. But dear God, they're trying.
Thanks, Ruth. James.
So I'm going to sort of try and tackle two related ones, which was, you know, is there a way to get better representation? And are there any signs within the centre-left of how serious the problem is? And, you know, in terms of listing unpopular characteristics, I'm not only of the centre-left, I'm also a mainstream media journalist. And we have quite similar problems across the two of those in that, you know, we're losing trust, we're losing following, and we're seeing sort of new media arise, you know, things like the canary, like fake news, like polarized news, in the same way as we're seeing new parties. And journalism and the centre-left are reacting in pretty much the same way and kind of just carrying on doing what they were always doing and telling the public they're wrong for not buying it anymore. It turns out that's not a winning strategy either as a newspaper or as a party. And so, no, both are clueless. It turns out, you know, when people change, you need to change with them. It doesn't mean buying into, you know, xenophobic agendas or buying into the worst of it, but it also doesn't mean just sort of trying to put a new slogan or a new lick of paint on what you always did. When it comes to sort of the presentation side of this, I think there's a really odd habit that we have on the left of almost sort of calling out the other side as being unfair when they have a better line or a catchier line. And the one that always occurs to me is sort of Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. Nigel Farage is a former trainer who has been a European politician claiming lavish expenses for a very, very long time. And Boris Johnson is a bloody Etonian who was in the cabinet until a couple of months ago. And they can both present themselves as anti-establishment, which is completely nonsensical. And so people sort of on my side of the argument tend to sort of remark that that's unfair, rather than just thinking, well, if they can look anti-establishment, if they can connect with normal people, if they can sound like an actual bloody human, why can't you? And so, you know, Nick Clegg has about as much power as my cat, and yet somehow manages to look like Mr. Establishment and Mr. Politician, until you get people who can actually look and sound like a convincing human being. You're going to keep losing on the political arguments. So that's where it starts.
Thank you very much, James. Right, we're going to go out for the final time.
Thanks very much. I very much agreed with everything that you said, Ruth and John. The main division seems to be that the people who wanted to remain, their main argument was economic, as you said, James. It was about money, comfort, material security, peace, prosperity, that sort of thing. And on the whole, all the people like me who voted to leave, from every background, class, rich, poor, young, old, voted for sovereignty. And that, to me, seems the major division, not left or right.
Hi there. I just wanted to say I'm amazed how little has been made of the issue of immigration in this conversation. The idea that this is about economics has very little basis in fact. A professor at Birkbeck University called Eric Kaufman is about to release a book called White Shift, in which he talks about the fact that your income had very little predictive ability for predicting whether you would vote leave or not. A white working class person in London was actually more likely to vote leave than a white working class person elsewhere in the country. 70% of white British people who voted to leave said they would be willing to sacrifice up to 10% of their income to reduce immigration. And as an immigrant myself, the reason I bring this up is it concerns me that we're not having this conversation honestly, because when the backlash comes against this kind of attempt not to talk about immigration, Ruth, I think you're the only one who mentioned it, it's going to be immigrants like me and it's going to be ethnic minorities who are going to bear the brunt of that.
You said right at the outset, Tom, are we overplaying this? And the title of the afternoon is Anti-Establishment Revolt. Much of what we've been talking about seems very moderate to me, really. Not compared to, say, the poll tax riots and the non-payment campaign. Not compared to the miners' strike and the 60s. And then if you want to combine the two and talk about an anti-establishment revolt, aren't we now talking about something like the defeat of communism by so many protests, some peaceful, some violent, that overturned decades and decades worth of oppression? This isn't that. What we've actually got is political choice. But some seek to explain it as revolt. Some like to think of it as anti-establishment because the European Union has become, to a minority, a strange sort of cult. It's like we're all Scientologists. And some of us have decided to leave. And the high priests of Scientology are now calling us out as anti-Scientologists. In truth, the most radical revolt we had was actually in 2015 when the British Tory party offered an unequivocal, in-out referendum on the EU membership, British membership of the EU, and there were enough people who decided to support it to create a genuine anti-establishment revolt.
First thing I wanted to say is I take a bit of exception, quite a lot of exception actually, to the comment that was made was basically suggesting why are LGBT groups and Jewish people voting for populist parties, so-called populist parties? Well, let me make this clear. I'm a UKIP voter, I'm gay man. Shock horror, we think for ourselves, we're individuals, we're not actually members of collective identity politics groups.
I want to.
That's the main point I want to make.
Yeah, and now you've made it, I'm going to go to that gentleman behind you. But thank you very much for that. If you just pass it back to him, then we're going to have to come back, I'm afraid.
Hello, yes, I'll try and be very quick. I just wanted to bring up the issue of, I thought it might be helpful to talk about Hungary and the issue with George Soros. And some people have picked up on immigration. I think it is a lot about immigration. A lot of people that vote Leave or that are in support of the government in Hungary are saying that there is a deliberate attempt to erode national European identities, and that the issue of anti-Semitism on the rise is not the case, is because actually there are people like Barbara Lerner Spector, who is the director of a cultural institute in Sweden called Paideia, who said that Europe is at the throes of a cultural shift, and that there is a deliberate attempt to dilute the identity of Europeans in order to control people because they're not being given what they want, and so the increase of authoritarianism is taking place, and so they are being denigrated and for their views on what they think is happening.
The current European settlement is disfranchising and uprooting millions of European citizens, eroding their communities and turning Europeans into migrants. That's why migration is a core issue. People have people are turning to cultural narratives. They've got cultural narratives to explain their condition. Soniansky's migrations, more recently SARS, Belgrade banned, the EU is associated as a Western Union transfer. The challenge is in terms of translating this discontent into finding a political party.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. James.
I think, let's just briefly tackle it and say explicitly, a lot of these populist parties and a lot of these populist movements explicitly tap into xenophobia, racism, or anti-Semitism, and we shouldn't ignore it and normalize them. They're fucking repellent. And so, a lot of the anti-Soros movement is like that, and some of the Brexit campaign was like that. Some of the Turkish stuff, some of the posters. There are plenty of people who voted to leave for absolutely non-racist reasons, but it did tap into some racist tropes, and it's pretty appalling that it did. I'm going to sort of kick to my core thing that everything's economics, though. People don't tend to care about immigration when they've got a job, when it's secure, and when their wage is going up. People tend to worry more about it when it's not. It doesn't mean there's no other issues with immigration. It doesn't mean people don't have concerns, but underpinning it, if you're doing all right, you tend to be more relaxed about it. It's part of why working, people of whatever class in London don't care that much about immigration. I think the big thing when we talk about the Brexit vote being economics versus sovereignty is Remain turned around and basically said to the country, oh, you've never had it so good, to a country where people were flat out broke and have been for years. It was the most out-of-touch, idiotic campaign in history. I mean, Leave basically faced an open goal. Let's be honest. Leave didn't sort of win for overspending or because of Cambridge Analytica or because of anything. Leave won because Remain ran a shit campaign.
On that note, John, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, it's interesting what someone said over there about the EU being a cult, and as a writer, I could see a lot of the ideas or a lot of the sort of obsession or this blind acceptance that the EU knows best, and where it's sort of leading. I could sort of see it in the novels of Orwell and Huxley and Ray Bradbury, people like that. And I was sort of surprised that no one sort of made those connections. The idea of Big Brother. When Big Brother was a character in a novel, not on a TV show. So yeah, there is that sort of blind utopian acceptance that the EU is going to make everything okay, and the only future is with the EU. That some people have sort of fallen into it, and I'd go back to what I sort of said at the beginning. I think the vote isn't about nostalgia and about these things. I think it is actually about a different sort of future. It's where does time begin, sort of thing. So yeah, I think this idea of the cult, you do see that in a small number of fanatical Remainers who, you know, have just gone, you know, just exploded with fury, actually. You know.
Thanks, John. Sasha.
I think it's completely about immigration. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. When I talk about nativism driving many of these populist parties on the right, that is by definition being driven by hostility towards immigrants. So I think you're absolutely right. I didn't speak as much about Brexit as some other people. I personally think that did play a role in the Brexit vote, and I think that Eric Kaufman's analysis is going to be very interesting when it comes out, both of this country and others. One question I just want to put out there, and I genuinely ask this as a question, perhaps it's not going to be very popular with the rest of the panel or the audience, but as someone who doesn't really have a dog in the Brexit fight, I'm curious about, as this debate over a second referendum takes shape here, just observing it, it strikes me that if the entire Brexit debate initially was about sovereignty and direct democracy and the idea that the people should vote, I wonder if, you know, if those who feel that way support a Swiss-style extreme referendum on every question at any given moment. It's the sort of argument you hear in Switzerland, but also from people like Geert Wilders, leaving aside his other politics, we should vote on everything. We should have more referenda all the time in Holland has been one of the central planks. And so I do wonder sometimes as I hear this debate, why there's such resistance among the Brexit crowd to the idea of voting again once the question has been distilled and is clear, which it does seem, regardless of position, that once a deal is struck, that people would know what they were voting for more clearly than they did the first time around. And I'm genuinely curious why that debate hasn't been taking place you know, among people who were diehard supporters of the first referendum.
I can only speak for myself, but all I can say is all up for referendums, just not on the same topic over and over and over and over and over again. But Ruth, do you want to take us out before we move on?
Right, well, I'll just take up that point of Sasha's, actually. It suits the culture of Switzerland, for reasons we could talk about another time. It does not suit the culture of here, and I think there is great distress about how divisive it was and how divisive the referendum was in Scotland. I come from a country that does referenda. I mean, the Irish do, and they're usually, unless they're very boring, they're very divisive. I mean, abortion recently was massively divisive. So I don't think there'll be any movement here to import that. Nobody wants it. Just doesn't suit the culture. I want to say two things just to finish. The first is how lucky we are, although there are lunatics about who call UKIP extreme. If it's such a British thing to have such a terribly respectable party as UKIP being our extremists. Ha ha. The anti-Semitism, might I remind James, is almost firmly in the hard left and a very unpleasant matter.
I mean, let's be honest, it's on both sides.
Well,
Labour has an anti-Semitism problem, but the right has it too.
Tomorrow,
okay.
Let's not say it's only Labour, because that was nonsense.
And the last thing is to say that I really don't want to be a member of a club that won't let me out.
Yeah, thank you very much. A round of applause for all of our speakers. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.